want to first of all thank the Academy and Dave and Alan for everything they've done and getting me out here. This is a great opportunity. I certainly take advantage of everything I can to get up in front of groups like this. You guys are a very advanced, progressive group of dentists, and it's pretty rare to have a group like this in a room talking about sleep. I usually spend my weekends talking to brand new people that are just getting started in this. So an opportunity like this to talk to an advanced crowd like you guys, I certainly appreciate. Talk a little bit about myself, where I come from, why you should listen to me. Dave sort of gave me the intro a little bit and said I was one of the old school Ed Spiegel people, and I really was. Dr. Spiegel was a mentor of mine, and I owe more to him than I could ever give him credit for. But I started working with him back almost 17 years ago in his practice in Erie, and I actually moved here to Scottsdale with him and started helping him do these programs, going around the country, teaching people what he was doing, which had a lot to do with some of the same technology I'm going to show you guys here in the next few minutes. And Ed was successful with it in his practice, and he really wanted others to duplicate that success, and he was certainly a pioneer in this field that didn't exist back when he started. And it was a very rogue group of people. I'm sure some of you all were his friends and colleagues even back then. And it's certainly impressive to see where it's come in that relatively short time. But I helped him go around the country teaching these little 2-day programs every other weekend and little tiny hotel rooms, and slowly gaining traction. Our company now, Sleep Group Solutions, was started in 2005, really with the purpose behind it of just getting all these different pieces of the puzzle under one umbrella. A lot of you guys have worked with us. I know a ton of you all here, and it's awesome to see everybody. It's fun to come into these kind of meetings and seeing all that. So it's been a cool journey over the last 15 or 16 years for myself. I started out as a patient. Ed's son was my roommate in college, and so when I was 19 years old, I didn't know anything about dental sleep medicine or sleep apnea or snoring or anything, other than I knew I was driving my roommate absolutely bonkers with my snoring in our dorm room. And so he lured me to Erie, Pennsylvania to get he actually lured me with fishing. He was like, "You're gonna come fishing," but really the trick was go to my dad's practice. I got a silencer, the Hallstrom appliance back then, and I've worn it every night for the past 20 years. Not that one, that would be gross, but dozens of others. And I can honestly count probably on one hand how many nights I've gone without an appliance since then. And I've really dedicated my life now and my career to getting other offices up and running and out there. We do about 100 CE programs annually, and I've been in thousands of offices helping them, some of you all right here actually, helping them get started with dental sleep medicine and all the processes, protocols, documentation, instrumentation, and everything that come to make this field. So that's who I am and where I come from, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to share everything I can in this short window with you all today. Some goals of this brief talk. One is talk about time. We're going to talk about time and how it can be really good or really bad. And as we talk about reimbursements and Medicare and different rates and in-network negotiation agreements and all these things, time is sort of, it needs to be an ally. We need to make sure we're very efficient in these cases. We talk about our overheads and all the different pieces and the lab bills and things, but really time is an essential piece of this, being efficient in our case. But it's also essential in creating success and compliance with our patients. And that's something I'm kind of a data nerd and a spreadsheet nerd. I have more spreadsheets on this computer than anybody should have. And that's one of the things I've started looking at is patient compliance as it relates to speed and titration, and how many times do we have to crank these screws or bars or straps or whatever mechanism it is to reposition them, and what does that do with their confidence and compliance and success rates long term. And one thing that we found is that if we can speed this process up, if we can get them to a quote-unquote treatment position, which I'm going to talk a lot about, as fast as possible, which doesn't mean way protruded. It means an effective position with a minimal amount of movement. they're more compliant, they're more successful, they feel better faster, they're going to stick to it longer. We'll talk about case acceptance. A couple little pet peeves of mine, things that are not really related to airway imaging and some of the technology I'm going to talk about, but just strategies for this, strategies for presenting cases. And in my position where I can sit in my office and talk to all of you all on a weekly basis, and I get calls and emails and text messages, and when I hear people say, well, guys, we're just having a hard time getting people to say yes, it's like, well, why? How on earth? I believe that people are not inherently suicidal. I believe that they generally want to be okay, so why on earth are we having a hard time getting people to say yes? And some of it boils down to your strategy. It boils down to how you're presenting information and the order that you're presenting information and how we're presenting this therapy and these treatments. But also using all the tools that we have available to create some confidence and create some belief and increase that acceptance, because it's bad for you, but it's really bad for that patient when that case doesn't proceed forward because of something so trivial and silly as money or insurance or deductibles or whatever other reason they're going to give you, which is BS, as to why they're not going to do this. I told you I'd talk about pharyngometry, so I'm actually going to show you. We'll actually run one live here so you can see it for a minute. I know a number of you already have one of these and are using it, but we'll talk a lot about airway imaging and how we can use this as our ally through various parts of this protocol. It doesn't have to be this controversial thing that I know there's a lot of stuff out there, and I'm happy to talk about those myths and try to just give you guys who haven't had exposure to this some clarity and some information, and hopefully just a new understanding as to what this is, how we can measure airways, and more importantly, how we can use that information to increase case acceptance, to speed up titration, in some cases eliminate the whole concept of titration, and really become more profitable, because now we're saving time. And all these things start to tie together. I'll start some questions. I'll give you some answers, my opinion answers that we've come to find in hundreds and thousands of offices nationwide. And that's really, I think, the privilege that I have is I can stand here and in everything that I teach, everything that we're talking about, everything I'll share with you today and that we show in all our weekly programs, like right now today we have a program going on in Salt Lake City, another program going on in Washington, D.C. We'll be back here next week in Phoenix, not to this hotel, but nearby for another one. So we're constantly doing this. But one of my advantages is I can survey offices nationwide. And so we can pick and choose the very best techniques, the best strategies. You all have a lot to learn from each other. And some of you are phenomenally successful at certain pieces of this. So I think if we all work together, we can share this info and all become more successful as a group. So let's talk about titration, because I think it's a funny word as it relates to dental sleep medicine, how we've kind of adopted it, right? What is it? It's dosing, right? Titration is dosage. That's where it really came from. It came from mixing little chemicals in beakers and trying to measure that stuff out. And then medicine sort of adopted it and saying, okay, well, it's changing the dosage based on what the patient needs. And in some ways, it certainly has a role with CPAP, with all PAP therapy in general, right? Because we've adopted that word, and certainly CPAP pressure can be titrated and adjusted. But I think we sort of absorbed it into this dental sleep world, and I don't like it, because really titration, what does it really mean? What does it mean to us? What does it mean to you guys with your appliances? It means you weren't right? It means you weren't in the right spot. And so now we're going to change something and try to make it right. And if that doesn't work, we're going to change it again and try to make it right. And if that doesn't work, we're going to continue to change it and make it right until we magically get to this end point that we don't really know where is or if it even exists. So, titration to me is guessing, and unfortunately as a baseline to that, it's guessing wrong. And so why can't we eliminate that? Why can't we use more information that can be at our disposal to try to reduce that, and try to reduce the amount of guessing, try to reduce the amount of time that we're spending time in your chair, time in your office, time with your assistants, teaching them how to change these screws and straps and bars and hooks and everything they're doing with these appliances to adjust them, and hopefully create a goal. Create a goal before we start, because you can't get there if you don't know where there is. And I think that's an important piece of information that we can really run with. So treatment position and titration, with CPAP is a relatively easy concept, and this is just endoscopy looking down at an airway, and that's increasing CPAP pressures, right? With increasing centimeters of water pressure. With PAP, you're all well aware of that. You've all experienced that. You know your patients, and certainly, when we look at a dental sleep case, we like to have these people down in this range that are responsive to lighter PAP pressures. If they need 20 centimeters of water pressure, that's a pretty intense airflow that's going to be hard to remedy with an appliance. But the takeaway from this is that there's an end point to it. Titration implies, by its nature, by the word, implies dose dependency. Right? It implies that more is better, and more is better still, and more is better than the one from before. And that's sort of true, but it's sort of not. Right? It has some somewhat truth to it. There's an end point, and there's a point of diminishing returns. Just like you can see here with the CPAP pressures, right? 1 centimeter of water to 2 doesn't open that airway enough, but statistically, percentage-wise, it yields a pretty significant return. And from 2 to 4, it doubles. And from 4 to 6, it doubles. And then 6 to 8, you get a nice little return there. But eventually, you get to a point where increasing pressure, what's that doing to the airway? Not much. It's creating side effect. It's creating negative experience to the patient. It's creating side effect from all the high pressures and intolerance and maybe mask issues and leakage and all the side effects that we know that exist with CPAP. But really, how much bigger is the airway, from this end point to here? Not much. And the same thing exists with appliances. It's not just this endless thing where you yield these huge incremental returns. Eventually, you get a point of diminishing returns. You get to a point where you could still crank the screws, you could still change the straps, but eventually, not a whole lot more is happening. Our goal should be not to max out their titration, not to crank this out as far as it can go or beyond, which I've heard, which seems crazy to me. Not to do that, but instead find the least extreme position, just like with CPAP, right? Their goal is to find the number that opens the airway and creates stability and gets rid of these events in the least extreme way possible. Because they know if they keep cranking, all that happens is bad. All that happens is intolerance, noncompliance, side effect. So our goal is a treatment position, right? To find a position for the mandible that yields this kind of return, but no further. Find this end point. And it goes to what I said earlier in finding our goals and creating a goal, knowing where the end of the road is so we can drive there. I'm not saying don't adjust your appliances. I'm saying adjust to a point where you know exists, as opposed to just this endless process that I've seen people do, and a lot of bad stuff comes from that. So this says, what if there was a way to find this treatment position, without this adjustment, without titration? I'm going to show you a way. You don't have to listen, you don't have to follow, but I'm going to show you a way that works well for me. It's going to work well. It's working well for dozens of you sitting here right now in this lecture. So let's talk about goals. So I think this is funny too. Some of the things I've heard people say. What's the goal? What's your goal of appliance therapy? What are we doing with these devices, right? Is it to slowly advance them to max protrusion? Certainly don't want to start them there on day one, but is that the goal, to just slowly advance, whether you're doing the advancing or the patient's doing the advancing? Is it, I've heard this, to advance them past that, right? You've all heard that in a lecture before, right? You can go to max, and then if you just really push them, you can go beyond max. That seems odd, but maybe, I don't know. To comfortably relieve symptoms, to reduce AHI and all our objective metrics as much as we can. What's our goal, right? How about reducing snoring and subjective issues, quality of life improvements? There's a lot of goals that I see people try to follow, and they just don't seem to make sense to me. I like the, to titrate, and then we're going to retest them with either pulse ox or HST, and then we're going to readjust. Whether it's you or the patient doing it, I see that all the time. And then we're going to retest them again. maybe mix in some subjective questionnaires, and then we're going to readjust and test again and just continue on and on and on. And that's really the issue that I had with time and how that's costing you more money. That's the most expensive piece of overhead in your cases, and you don't realize it's happening. So let's try to get rid of, avoid that. Let's try not to go down that road if we can. How about this for a goal? Right? We always talk about this in our lectures and our courses. Let's talk about MMI. What's MMI? Maximum medical improvement, right? We're going to try to find the maximum yield, the best result possible with the least amount of moving. Right? The least amount of moving possible. I don't want to crank them out as far as I can. I want to crank them out as little as I can. I want to open them as little as I can that yields the best results. Find this treatment position and get them there. Maybe even start them there. But you got to know where you're going in order to get there. And maybe stop driving blind, because that's not good for anybody, including your patients. So, we'll give you a better way, or at least a way. So this talks about what I just said. What's your biggest overhead? It's not your lab bill or your supplies or your medical billing or employees or whatever, it's your time. So how do we reduce chair time, stop guessing position, hopefully, put them in an ideal spot as fast as we can? I've actually tracked this. This is cool. I have some cool spreadsheet data, and the guy that recorded it all is in the process of getting it published, but I at least have some information to share. This is a practice in North Carolina that looked at compliance results. And he was kind of in a situation where he was doing a lot of sleep prior to using some of these objective measurements and pharyngometry and the testing and everything that we do that I'm going to talk to you about. Prior to doing any of that, he was doing some sleep, and he was tracking the results. So he looked at 50 patients, monitored for nightly compliance. I don't know the hours he attached to it to consider compliant, but nightly use of the oral appliance at 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. And one of the things they found is that when they started people in treatment position, when they averaged out these people that over long-term monitoring, they were 21% more compliant than this titration group. Over this time period. And that's an important thing for your patients, right? That's huge. That's important for you. That's important to your success rates. Why is that? When people feel better right away, they're going to keep wearing it, right? If I could put somebody in appliance and they wake up tomorrow morning and feel like a brand new person, like they've slept for the first time in the last 50 years, that creates excitement and motivation, and you can't pry that thing out of their hands. They're done. They're committed. They're married to it. Versus a person that's just, well, how'd you do? Well, my wife said I snore less. I think it's working. I don't know. Compared to that person, there's not as much belief. There's not as much passion. I care. I can't not have my device. You could never, ever get me to not sleep with it. And that's because it's working, and it yields that kind of result. And I think if you can get your patients there and you can get them there quick, that's the same kind of excitement they're going to have. They're more likely to continue on with it, as opposed to kind of the doubts that get created. Okay, well, let's just change this out. Come back in. We're going to change it a little bit and go back and see what happens. Let's have your wife do a survey and see what she said she observed, or what how loud was your snoring on a scale of 1 to 10 and all that kind of stuff. Let's get them there as fast as we can. Other stuff that we can kind of touch in, and some of this is related to what we'll talk about with imaging, some is not, but case acceptance, these are just kind of like the short list of John's pet peeves that I found and struggled with and done battle with in offices, some of yours actually around the country. So is everybody saying yes? Because that would be really cool, right? But they're not. It'd be nice, but it's not happening. So if we're not getting 100% case acceptance, why? Why aren't we? What are the actual issues and barriers that we're running into? And I know the rebuttals that you're going to say. I know, what makes people say yes, and why do they say no? And do you think it's the same thing? Right? Is it the same reason why they would say yes or no? No, it's not. But they're both within your control. You can fix them. You can address them. You can put those issues to bed. But you got to understand how to present things, how to introduce this therapy the right way. And I want this for you. I want everybody in here to be more successful with this. And I want one extra patient next week to say yes and accept treatment because of it. And I don't want these dumb reasons to come into play, issues about money and deductibles and insurance and costs and fees. It doesn't matter. I can tell you that going around, with our mentor, Ed, around the country back in the day where insurance billing didn't exist for this. Medicare didn't exist. I mean, Medicare existed. Medicare didn't pay for it. But there was no billing. There was nothing. This was fee for service. And even now today, I've got practices around the country that are incredibly successful just charging cash. So what's the difference? Why? It's not the money. And as soon as we make it about money, we really belittle what we're offering. And I think there's a lot of good psychology and a lot of good techniques that you guys should be implementing. And I'll touch on some of them here. And some of these things relate to dental sleep. Some of them can be transferred and use it for all parts of dentistry in your office. But people say yes because why? Because of perceived benefit, right? Because of perceived need and confidence. That's why they're going to say yes. If you can't get those three things in place, it's over. It's not about your pretty little appliance and selling acrylic or how much you're going to get insurance to cover. It's not about that. Okay? If you can't create those things, there is no case acceptance. And I don't care if it's for dental sleep medicine or for implants or for cosmetic dentistry or whatever it is you're doing. That doesn't matter. Those are the things. And people say no because you failed to create that. You can create those things, you can do those things, but we got to do it the right way. And we'll talk about perceived benefit and perceived need, and I'll talk about a technique for building confidence. Because confidence comes from you. It comes from you and how you present it, the way you talk about it, and your confidence, whether you believe it or you say it to them or not, how confident are you that this is going to be beneficial to them? And that's really where it kind of leads back to what I was led with and what we're going to be talking about with imaging and pharyngometry and how we can use these tools to our disposal. Forget about the clinical aspects, which I'll get to, but there's a confidence aspect. There's an aspect of, hey, I know it's going to work. Here, let me show you it's going to work before you've even said yes. So there's all that, right? Stop selling acrylic. Stop talking about appliances. They don't care what appliance you're using or what it looks like or how pretty it is or how colorful it is or anything else. It looks like a big chunk of plastic and it's not that appealing. Even though in your dental eyes it's the coolest thing ever. In the patient eyes, that thing's scary. It's going to bug them. They're not going to like it. So stop selling the thing because it belittles what you're offering. And it also creates unnecessary competition that shouldn't even exist. Right? Who's our competition now if we start selling appliances? The Pure Sleep that they saw on TV yesterday for 2 payments of $29.95, that's your competition. Right? The Zipa appliance they hear about on the radio for 99 bucks and all these other things. I don't want to compete with that. But those are appliances. And it's real hard to differentiate what you're offering to what those things are in the patient's mind. How is yours worth $6,000 and theirs is worth 80 bucks? Is yours that much better? No. Let's talk about what you're going to create for them though, right? You're not selling appliances, you're selling outcomes. Let's talk about our chiefs. These are important, right? Everybody writes the chief complaint down somewhere. All right, it's on some piece of paper. It should be on your records, your documentation somewhere there. Chief complaint should be written down. It's usually at the first appointment, that initial sleep consult. Why are you here? Why are we talking? What's broken? What's wrong? What's their chief complaint? And you better make sure you know what it is. Because you'll come up with 1,000 other reasons that are wrong with them. But if they came in there and their chief complaint is they're snoring, I don't care if they have hypertension and reflux and morning headaches and they're crashing their car driving. Those are all the other side effects and comorbidities from their apnea. But their chief complaint is still the top of that list, even though it's probably the least important of those items. What's their chief disability? Chief disability is how that chief complaint is negatively impacting their life. That's an important thing to know. And that's a conversation you guys need to have throughout this process so you could constantly keep reminding them of what they really hated the most and how it's hurting them. So their chief complaint is I snore. What's their chief disability? My wife makes me sleep in the guest room now, right? That's their disability. That's how their chief complaint is breaking them and causing harm. So when we talk about treatment, and when we sit them down and say, hey, look, this is what the sleep physician's prescribed for you, and you show them the appliances and all the cool stuff you can do, are you selling them this really cool piece of acrylic? No, you're selling them the chief benefit. What's the chief benefit? How that chief disability is going to get knocked out. Mr. Patient, aren't you looking forward to being able to sleep in the same bed with your spouse again? Talk about positive outcomes. You take all their complaints and you flip them to a positive outcome. I think if you just do those three things and you do them properly, your case acceptance goes up just because of that alone. Because that creates need. That creates perceived benefit and need. You're not selling them a thing, you're selling them an outcome, life outcomes, positive changes. You do the same thing with cosmetic dentistry and veneers and whatever else. You know, your veneers, you're not selling all the pretty porcelain. What are you selling? Right? The benefit. What's the benefit? You're going to be able to smile for the pictures at your daughter's wedding, right? Whatever it is. As soon as you figure that stuff out, you create need, they say yes. So, what's the third one on my list? Confidence. If you walk in the room and say, well, I hope this is going to work, it probably will. It's better than not working, right? Better than surgery. You know, I don't know, whatever you're going to say, that's not good. Maybe something objective there will help. That's what I kind of took a little snapshot of a pharyngometer screen up here, but without getting into all the crazy details, I realize some of you all know this already. But when you can show them that their airway improves greatly with your proposed appliance in, with a little bite jig in place, which is doing the same exact thing as your appliance, and you could show them a 135% improvement in the narrowest point in their airway, that should make you excited, because that's going to give you a lot of confidence that, hey, this isn't a guess, this isn't a hope and pray, this is actually going to work. And then that confidence now translates to that patient. Now they're going to see it and have something to grasp onto, and hopefully they start to believe that too. Now it's not a flyer. Now it's not a, well, okay, let's take a risk and see what happens. Now it's a lot closer to a sure thing. And that confidence that your team has, that confidence that you have, all translates to the patient. If you can show them that it's going to work before they say yes, you're in good shape. So what does everything that I've talked about here, a lot of the things anyway, have in common? And it's all information, knowledge, right? Information about airway, size, stability, collapsibility, how it behaves when we change it. Because that's what we're doing with these devices, right? We're moving them around, so we're changing airway. How does the airway respond to that change? Knowledge is power, right? Knowing that this is going to happen, knowing what's going to happen before it happens is important. So let's talk about pharyngometry, because that's really why I got up here to talk, and I hope to be able to run through one here in a few minutes and get you that good information. So let's talk about that. And we'll get past some of the myths and some bad information that I've seen kind of taught out there and repeated, and all the questions that I know some of you guys have. Maybe there's not time in the lecture here to address them, but certainly outside in the exhibit hall I can. I'll address some of the common ones, the things that everybody asks me about this as a group. So one more question before we keep going too, right? Is sleep apnea a disease of airway size? No, not really. Body size maybe, but not airway size, right? It's a disease of airway compliance and collapsibility. People with really big airways can have sleep apnea, right? I'm a big dude. I got a big airway. If you test my airway on a cone beam or whatever else, pharyngometer, it's big, right? It's not small. There's no choke points, but it's extremely collapsible. That's why I have severe sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is the disease of airway compliance. And you see that, flexibility, collapsibility, not so much this baseline airway size. And that's one of the things that we're going to repeatedly look at here with pharyngometry. So before I run some live, I want to look at a little case, because I think this is an interesting one, and this is something that I see. I could seriously see one of these every single day. People send these to me by email dozens and dozens and dozens of times a week. And things like this are hurting you. Things like this are hurting everybody in this room. Whether this is your patient, I hope it's not, or not, it's harming us as a collective group. Because what it's doing is it's eroding confidence in that sleep physician, whoever was involved with this patient, it's eroding confidence in dentistry's ability to manage relatively mild sleep apnea. And they don't really know or see the difference sometimes between your appliance and your techniques and your neighbors. And if your neighbor is just slapping in an upper and lower impression and just checking off snore appliance on their lab slip and hoping and praying something good happens, a lot of times this is what happens, and it makes you look bad, it makes your neighbor look bad, it makes everybody in our field look bad. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves. So this is somebody that, you know, you see the very aged tap appliance there that the patient was received in October 2010. Per the instructions of the dentist that made it for him, he maxed it out. He cranked the screw to maximum, and then he ultimately came to one of our instructors in Pennsylvania in December 2012. He said his jaw hurt, he's having a hard time getting his bite back together, he thinks his teeth are moving, he's not comfortable, he doesn't know if it's working or not, but he'd still continued to wear it, which is impressive. And his original diagnosis was very mild. This should have been a slam dunk, right? So what did he do? He sat him down, he tried to look and measure and do his best to figure out where the heck this appliance was at and what it was doing for him or not doing for him. So you can't really do the measurements with the acrylic all cloudy like that. But eventually he sat him down and just put his appliance in and said, okay, we'll do a pharyngometer. We're going to measure his airway with this appliance, without it and with it, and let's see what happens. So without his appliance in, his airway measured out with an average size of 0.98 square centimeters. That's really small. That's a narrow airway. That's a small opening, right? 0.98, minimum opening of 0.37 square centimeters. That's a tiny, tiny, tiny opening. That's not a good airway. But then he put his appliance in and it basically didn't change at all. His appliance, however open it was, at however far forward he was, which is really far, it didn't do anything. In fact, overall, it made his airway 9% smaller. So without knowing anything, I know for a fact this isn't going to work. No wonder the guy's not happy and not compliant and having all these side effects. It's not doing anything for him. So what do we do now? Just for kicks, let's do another sleep study and see, because he was only a 5.7 AHI to start. Where is he now? You know, he's at an 8.4 with his appliance in. So it actually got a little worse. Now, part of that's, night to night variability or whatever, who knows, but it's definitely not helping him. It's sending him in the wrong direction. So what's the plan now? And the plan now is just to start from scratch. So you just saw Bob up here, from Airway Metrics, and that's what they've got in his mouth now. They got an Airway Metrics jig. They're going to do another pharyngometer test. They've probably done, honestly, 6 or 7 different tests in different positions, trying to find something that would create some improvement, some size, some stability. They found a position, I don't know what that is. It looks like an 8 vertical and maybe 3 horizontal. That gave him an 81% improvement in minimum, a 29% improvement overall. Patient's comfortable. He's in a much less extreme position than he was before. He's open probably a little bit more. He's not nearly as protruded as he was. Did a bite registration there. This is Dr. Nat's case. I'm not going to get into how and why we use different techniques for bites. He uses alu wax wrapped on the end of the bite forks. That's his thing. He does dozens of these a month. It works for him. That's happy for him. I know some of the lab guys here will say, don't send wax bites, and that's fine. I don't do whatever you're going to do. That's not my job to decide. But what he did is he put a bite fork in the position that he measured to be ideal. He had the appliance built in that ideal position. Follow-up sleep study, apnea index now is 0. He had no time under 90 saturation. 96% of the study was supine. It worked well. And that's the whole point. The whole point is we knew where we needed to go. We put him there. We fixed it. That's hard to do with guessing. I doubt very much we would have just shotgunned in an appliance at that exact position, right? We probably wouldn't have. If we were just going to take a random impression, or if we're just going to guess where we're going to go, is that what we would have guessed? Probably not. So this gives us that objective information. Now, what happens with titration? Doesn't exist, does it? We don't need to go anywhere else. There's nowhere else to go. So now it's just a follow-up sleep study, and now he's on a long-term case. Another case, a very, very similar example to what we just saw. And again, this is the stuff that I see over and over and over, and why we can hopefully do collectively better as a group. So here's a patient now, 77 years old, intolerant to CPAP, had UPPP surgery that was ineffective, referred for an appliance to his own dentist, got one. They did a split night study with the appliance in place at the lab. It actually made him worse. And now they're like, okay, what can we do? His appliance is worsening his baseline. So let's look at his numbers. Current diagnostic study is AHI is 19, RDI is 28. This is a watermark Aries study. I mean, you've all looked at these a million times. There's nothing fancy there. This is just a quick picture of his CPAP titration, which pretty much knocked it down to 0, so there's no mysteries there. CPAP works, but he wasn't wearing it. He was completely intolerant. He refused. So he had a split night study with his old appliance that his own general dentist had made him, and basically it worsened him. He was at a 9.2 and 23 without the appliance in. They put it in, he was at 17 and 29. So his appliance, however far open and forward he was not doing its job. You've all seen this. You've all dealt with patients that have come to you in this way. And hopefully we can, again, as a group, try to erode this, because this is bad for us. The sleep physician that did this split night study probably didn't just get a bad thought about that one dentist who made this appliance. He probably thought, hey, you know what? These guys don't know what they're doing. We're not going to send for those anymore. And that's bad for the patients. It's bad for you. So let's try to find a better way. Looking again at some pharyngometry readings, I haven't explained this yet, how to read these graphs and these numbers. Those of you that do this get it. When I run it live, it's going to make a lot more sense, and I'll switch the projector over and do it in just a minute. But the bottom line is his airway was collapsing down to a 1.2 square centimeter minimum, which is a very narrow opening, not as bad as the last case, but still pretty narrow. So that's a narrow opening. He doesn't have a very stable airway. And so what's the next step? The next step is to use those airway metrics jigs, just like we saw in the last case. Try to find a position that creates some stability. Let's make that minimum cross-sectional area, that choke point, that point that's going to create negative pressure and ultimately collapse and cause obstruction. Let's make that go away. Let's make that larger. Let's try to make it as large and stable as we can. A 10 millimeter vertical at edge-to-edge position provided maximum improvement. So when we look at kind of a pre and post airway, we see basically the airway doubling in size, going from a 1.2 to a 2.5, 97.7% increase. Again, this goes back to that confidence thing we just talked about, right? That's going to create some confidence with the patient. If you could show them, hey, no guarantees in this life, but we can double the size of your airway if we put you in this position, that'll make them excited, should make you excited. And now you have some guidance. You know where the end of that road exists now. You know where they need to be, as opposed to just shotgunning them in there. Again, I dare say we probably would not have guessed a 10 millimeter vertical opening at an edge-to-edge position was ideal if we were just taking a shot in the dark blind. Probably not, anyway. So what are they doing in this case? Putting the airway metrics jig in, and he's actually going to do a scan. So I forget what kind of scanner he's using, CareStream, I think, but he's scanning the bite digitally there, which we've done a lot of now. It's kind of a trendy thing to do, but he's taking a digital bite with the airway metrics jig in place. You can record it with certainly the new generation of scanners do a good job with this. Made a Panthera appliance in the correct position. Again, day one delivery, correct appliance position, no changing straps, no messing with it. Day one deliver, follow-up sleep study, AHI's 1, RDI's 4, SpO2 minimum's 89, but that's a really successful result. Again, with no titration, no adjustment. Certainly based off his baseline, that's phenomenal. That's a good result. Here's our 3 kind of positions. His diagnostic sleep study, his CPAP titration, I'm going to be totally random and just guess an appliance and see what happens position, and then one where they actually knew where to go. Not bad. So, Let's actually run it and see it live, and I do want to address a couple of things that I know for a fact you guys are thinking about, and we're running out of time, so I got to go fast. Like 100 of you have pharyngometers already, so this is going to be really boring and repeat stuff. If you don't, maybe this is cool and it's something you haven't seen before, but at the very least, it'll be some information that you really can hopefully run with, and if you want to learn more about it, come talk to me, whatever, that's fine. I just want to get good information out there because there's so many myths, so many rumors, so many bad things that I hear people say, oh, this doesn't work because of this. Okay, well, let's address all these things right now as a group. So first thing, just real simple on the screen, we've got our big graph here on the top. That's where all the data goes. We've got our 4 graphs across the bottom. Hopefully I'm not standing in front of too many of them for you guys. Real simple stuff. Our measurements come out on the side. So what the purpose of the system is to measure airway size. Airway size, cross-sectional area as a function of distance. It uses sound waves, right? So as it's running, it's using that clicking sound. Sort of like a bat flying through a cave. It's using sonar. Every click is one sound pulse into the airway. It reflects out. Microphones in the tube pick up that reflection, and it's able to map out the size of our opening as we travel back down the airway. So first graph here is labeled baseline, and it's kind of a reference point. It's not whether you have a good airway, bad airway, stable, not stable, just what are we working with? What did mom and dad give you for an airway? Because these are not magical airway growing beans, right? These appliances aren't going to make your airway magically huge. What are they going to do? They're going to take flexible, collapsible, flappy tissue and tighten it up and create tone where there wasn't tone before. So not so much growing the airway as it is making it less flappy, less collapsible, less flexible. And that's really the whole nature of sleep apnea. So that's what we're trying to do. So what are we working with as a baseline reference point? So for our patients, mouthpiece goes on. I'm just going to have them do normal breathing through their mouth during a baseline test, kind of like this. Now during that test, nothing should really be moving much. The line should be relatively stable. It shouldn't be bouncing all over the screen. It should just be what it is, nice and calm and stable. I could reproduce it over and over. There should be less than 5% test-to-test variability. Doing it in a dental chair is a little better as opposed to a giant lecture room standing in front of everybody because you could sit them down. They can be straight. You have a headrest for them so they can be nice, clean, reproducible position. They're not looking off to the side trying to see the screen. So all those things are kind of working against me. But aside from that, this should be nice and clean. So what is this? What is this line? What is this telling us? Right? It's telling us two things. It's telling us size, how big, and how far. So at any point on this line, what it's telling me is how big the airway is, how big the opening is as we're traveling further and further and further down. So right away at 0 centimeters, there's a big spike up, right? This is the end of this is the anterior teeth, end of the wave tube here. Right away there's a big spike up over the first 5, 6, 7 centimeters in. Why? It's your mouth, right? It's oral cavity. So if I had a real broad arch, high palate, small tongue, which I have none of those things, this might go really high, right, and come back down because there'd be more space. It's all about space. Now as this starts to travel back down, now where are we? Right, back of the mouth. Tongue, tonsils, uvula, soft palate, everything kind of coming together, little choke point, usually around 8 centimeters. You see the curve, you see the turn. That'll be the OPJ, the oral pharyngeal junction, the beginning of the airway. Now I still have my tonsils, but you can barely see them. If I had big giant tonsils that were almost touching each other, this might drop way down here, right? Because they'd be occupying all that space. If I had a real low draping soft palate, same thing. I don't, so that's not the case. But you'll see that here. So that's OPJ. Now as we travel back, once we clear past that tissue, there's really not much there. You go into the oral pharynx. The oral pharynx, there's nothing there. It's the gap between the soft palate and epiglottis. You have the base of the tongue, the back of the throat. There's really no other parts. Usually there should be an opening there. You're going to see epiglottis in the 17, 18, 19 centimeter range. You'll see another dip, hypopharyngeal space below that. So bottom line, somewhere in here, I'm trying to go fast, somewhere in here is where sleep apnea lives. Doesn't happen anywhere else in the body. That's the part that matters. So this is what we're going to focus on. So numbers that come out on the side, 3.08 square centimeters mean. What does mean? Mean is average, right? So it's saying the average size of my airway, 3.08 square centimeters. The minimum opening, which means the most constricted spot throughout the entire airway, 2¼ square centimeters. Those are both normal numbers according to the literature out there. You know, for men, there's normal ranges for men and women. Don't need to go over that now. All right. So if the first test tells me how big my airway is or what we're starting with, and it's called baseline, the second one's called collapse, and it's just the opposite. It tells me how small my airway can get. How collapsible is it? How flexible is it? In the literature, you'll see it referenced as an RV test or residual volume test. Sometimes people call it a modified Mueller maneuver. But basically, what we're going to do with our test is have the patient do one long, slow, smooth exhale. Instead of breathing normal, they're just going to push everything out. If I'm explaining to a patient, I might say it's kind of like a fire hose when you turn the water off. I want to see what happens. Does your airway stay open? Does it have tone? Does it maintain size and stability? Or is it like the fire hose that flops closed and crushes itself? So that's what we're looking for on this second test. So if I didn't have apnea, it would probably look pretty much like the first one. As I'm going through this test, you'll hear me exhaling, and you'll see the graph start to drop. You'll see this line, this part of the airway here that matters, start dropping, getting lower and lower and lower and lower and lower and lower on the screen. That's what we're trying to see. How small can this airway get? All right, for those of you with pharyngometry in here, if you walk in the room and see this, do I have a good airway or bad airway? Right, really bad airway, right? Like if I was behind a curtain and you had $1,000 to bet on whether or not I have sleep apnea, what would you bet? Right? It's not a good thing. All right, this gigantic black hole between these two lines is the problem, right? That's the flexibility, that's the collapsibility. When you snore, what is snoring? Snoring is vibration. Why does stuff vibrate? Because it's flexible and it can move. If there was tone, it wouldn't vibrate. When you choke on yourself, when you're having suffocating events throughout the night, why is that happening? It's happening because your airway gets really small and then there's some negative pressure to collapse it. I'll explain that in a second. So bottom line, what happened? My mouth stayed the same size, so that was cool. But everything else got really bad. Everything else collapsed down a lot. When you see a minimum opening of certainly less than 1 square centimeter, but you know, when you're down in this range, that's a far cry from normal. We usually like to get them up around 1.8 to 2 square centimeters if we can. That would be ideal. 0.4 is 100 miles from ideal. So what do I know now? I know that John's got a big airway. Okay, good for me. And it's incredibly unstable and very, very collapsible, which is a huge pre-test risk factor for sleep apnea. Now, do I need a sleep test? Absolutely. We need to diagnose it. This isn't a replacement of that. We just know it's broken. Now, fast forward. Fast forward to after. Once we know they're diagnosed, once we're going to try to fix them, once we're going to do some titration, do some adjustment, do some repositioning. That's really the meat of this, and I have 5 minutes, so I gotta go fast. So now we're gonna go to graph 3, and this is probably my biggest pet peeve, and I've already hit on it 3 or 4 times already with just kind of this blind, random repositioning. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put an airway metrics jig in, which is really freaking me out because this was on our table all day, and I guarantee like 50 of you touched this, but it was the only one I had. So it's okay. So, anybody have any like beer or whiskey I could dip it in or something? Whatever. So I'm gonna put this in my mouth. I see a lot of teaching out there. I see lab instructions. I see courses and people teaching. Okay, you just minimum vertical, right? 4 millimeters vertical. So open them as little as you can, and you bring them 60% forward, and boom, lock it in. That's your position. Make your appliance. You're golden. Okay, maybe. Occasionally, if you close your eyes and throw a dart, you'll hit the dartboard, right? Occasionally, you'll miss the entire board. That's sort of what I feel like happens with techniques like that. So let's do it even worse. I'm going to go 4 millimeters vertical and max protrusion, as far forward as I can push myself, which hurts, by the way. I'd never sleep like this. I did. I made an appliance here just to make a point. And my AHI, without anything, is 35 to 30 to 40, depending on the night. I made an appliance at 4 millimeters vertical and 8 millimeters horizontal past edge to edge, which is way the heck out there. What would my AHI go down to? 25. Bad, still bad. With the added bonus of my jaw hurt like hell for like 2 days. It's because it's not the right position for me. I can go in a better position, open up more than double that, but way less forward, that actually does the right job. Again, knowledge is power. So let's see. So I'm going to go 4 vertical and 8 or 7. This is the most horizontal. And we'll run a test and see how I do. See if it fixes my airway. We're going to do the same exact thing we did 2 seconds ago, except now I'm in a new position. Four vertical and 7 horizontal. There's our results. Did we make the airway bigger? Not really. No statistical significant difference. We made the minimum 14% larger. So it went from a really bad number to a really bad number, which isn't going to help me at all. But do you know how many appliances are running around in that position? More than should be. People that maybe failed treatment or went back on something else or tried surgery and went back to CPAP or whatever because we put them there and it didn't work and nobody was happy and there could have been a good result. Or worse yet, there's people that just get a little better. John, I'm sorry you went from 35 to 25. That's the best we could do. You know, it's better than nothing. How many of them are running around?
John,
again.
Your graph at first went way up. Why didn't you stop it there?
Because I hadn't done the collapse yet. Yeah, that would have been cool if I just stopped it right away. That would have been better. But no, I had to get to that end point just like I did on the first one. So just for demonstration, and with the last 2 minutes I have, and then I want to address a couple things and we'll be finished. I'm going to put my appliance in that I wear every night, which is at 10 vertical and 3 horizontal. All right, my face turned red, so you know it's working, right? I'm really pushing. Now what happens? You know, now we have my original airway with nothing in place, my new airway with my appliance in place. We're looking at improvements in the 200 to 300% range. We've more than doubled, almost tripled more than the minimum size. So that is a huge positive predictive indicator that, hey, if we can take it here, if we do our bite here, if we build our appliance here, there's a very good chance that, again, on day 1, if we want to build it this far out, we're in treatment position and we're in really good shape. I hope that makes sense. I hope that is that builds that confidence piece that I talked about. It also fixes your time issue, because now there's no titration. I don't even know if I have the straps for this. I wouldn't know. I don't need them. I don't need to move it. My AHI with that in is 5, 4, 5. All right. A couple things real quick. Questions I get all the time, and I'll ask them for you because nobody asked. Question 1 is, well, you're upright, right? Why are you doing that? Because you could obviously, especially in the dental office, you could go full supine. It would be easy to do a test that way. Here's a problem with testing supine, because believe it or not, in the 20 years we've been doing this, we tried that once or twice. So there's, we can answer that question. Why do we test upright instead of supine? First of all, when you take somebody with apnea and put them in a supine position, what's going to happen? So as you take me and recline me back down, what am I going to do? I'm conscious. I'm awake. So as I start to recline in your dental chair, what's going to happen? Jaw's going to come down and forward, tongue's going to thrust, and everything's going to go into don't choke mode, right? Because now I'm in a compromised position. And now my body's not just going to sit there and choke on itself, it's going to protect airway without me trying to. It's the same reason you're wrestling with people's tongues all day, right? You're putting them in a compromised position, they're protecting airway. So as I go down and back, I'm going to activate muscles, I'm going to create tone, I'm going to fight this test because my body doesn't want that to happen in that position. People without apnea don't have that same propensity to protect airway in a supine position. There's a good study that looked at that, gene glossus activity of apnea versus non-apnea patients in a supine position, and it talked about how they protect airway or not. So that's one of the reasons. So now when I'm on my back, the difference between my airway and somebody without a problem is less clear. When they're upright, it's clean, it's reproducible, it happens the same every time, and you can see it without fight. They're not fighting off the test. That's why we do it upright. Now the other thing that again comes up all the time, people ask me every day, how can this be accurate? You're awake. Obviously, right? Your airway's different when you sleep. Yes, I agree with that. 1,000,000% agree. Airway's different, muscle tone's different, everything's different. So here's my bad airway, right, as I'm talking to you. Who thinks my airway gets better when I go to sleep? No hands. Okay. So we can know that it's awful. It's almost completely closed. There's not really much more room to go while I'm awake talking to a couple hundred of you in a room. So we can be sure that it's at least this bad, probably a lot worse when I sleep. Now, if I can fix that airway and make it 300% larger while I'm sitting here talking to you, do you think that improvement might translate to sleep as well? Yes. So that's really this isn't telling me how big my airway is when I go to sleep and I'm in supine REM and all that. I don't know. What I know is it's bad here, and if I fix it, it gets better at night too. That's what matters. That's the means to an end. The other question people ask me, why didn't it close, right? Why didn't it close? There's still a straw. It's a little straw. It's like a coffee stirrer, right? There's a little straw. How come it didn't close all the way down? If you have apnea, it closes, right? It's because I didn't try to breathe, right? Why does apnea happen? Apnea happens at that moment between expiration and inspiration. When you take that breath in, what happens? This is a tiny opening. What happens when I try to suck lungs full of air through that tiny little hole? Right? Collapse, negative pressure. So we create that negative pressure, collapses airway, closes it off. That's why it didn't go all the way down, because I didn't try to breathe. So hopefully those things started to make sense, because those are questions I get about 1,000,000 times a week. Very fast to switch this back, and I know my time is up. So that's what I have. That's my time, too, 5 minutes more. Hopefully, after seeing all this, do you guys believe vertical maybe might occasionally have something to do with airway? I hope so. We can do a better job. I would more than love to help you guys do that. Thank you all again very much for the opportunity. There's my email, my cell phone number if you want to reach out. We've got a booth out there, so you can come find me out there, too. Thank you all very much.